That's it, you see? You know what that looks like? It looks like a miner's helmet. Light, right?
I'm recording it to put on YouTube.
Garden trail starts up on the lawn under the sycamore tree, which is this side, right up against the terrace there, on the owl.
Right.
We'll be through here about 10 minutes. It's easy at the end of our tour for you just turn back and go right on up, and you get there plenty of time to make the garden tour. If you're going to make the 3 o'clock ride. Well, let's get started. Janet, my name is Ed, and our purpose on this tour is to take you back a couple hundred years and enable you to sort of envision the life of slaves here in Monticello during Jefferson's years, 200 years ago approximately. Now, Jefferson was born about 2 miles in this direction. If we had some helicopters here, we could load up and fly 2 miles this way, drop 500 feet vertically, and we'd be on his father's old home place called Shadwell. It's now a pasture there with black Angus cattle grazing on it. In the middle of the field is an engraved, there's a birthstone there about this high, and the words are, "Here was born April 13, 1743, Thomas Jefferson, lover of liberty." That's the great man of the house. And need I say more? You all know the wonderful things he did for the country, and also the excellence and his high intelligence and his great creativity. So many fields, just to name them, from education to archaeology. All there, you know. That's not the Thomas Jefferson we talk about here. Thomas Jefferson of Mulberry Road is a pretty typical holder of slaves. He has, during his lifetime, 600 slaves passed through his ownership. And he's given time about 130 here at Monticello, another 70 or 80 south at Poplar Forest. Jefferson inherited 30-some slaves from his father and mother combined. He inherited 135 from his father-in-law. He will buy slaves. He will try to buy them as a family unit. Doesn't always work out. He will sell slaves. He sold 70 in a 10-year period to pay interest on his debt. He will gift slaves. When his eldest daughter, Patsy, became married, she was given 1,000 acres of land and 30 slaves. When the second daughter, Polly, got married, she was given only 800 acres of land, but she got her 30 slaves. Occasionally, a relative, there'd be a marriage in the family somewhere, and this is a large, involved family, this Jefferson family, and related Carters and related Randolph. It's a large family, so somebody be married, and they might have been here and say, "Oh, I really like that little Bobby we saw down by the kitchen. Could I have him? My daughter's getting married." And all of a sudden, somebody just appeared from the family. So there's the Jefferson of the house, there's the Jefferson of Mulberry Road. There's the young idealistic Jefferson, and there's the aging Jefferson, and their response to slavery is not the same. That young idealist, as a practicing attorney in the year 1770, and a good attorney at that, pleaded for the freedom of a slave under the charge that all people are naturally born free. He didn't succeed, but he made the plea. That young Jefferson, that idealist, also rebuked King George of England in his first draft of the Declaration of Independence for waging cruel war against human nature. That's what he said. That young Jefferson also had a plan, had a bill, drafted a bill. It had passed in Virginia. Anyone born in Virginia to a slave mother would be automatically free in the year 1800. If you're born after 1800, you're born free. And there were other actions by that young, and thoughts expressed by that young idealist that disappeared in the aging Jefferson, or they were hidden underneath in that aging Jefferson. Here's the aging Jefferson. Here's the posture that he got into. He comes back from France, he's been there 5 years. Comes back and spends a lot more money, a lot of it on our behalf, than he received in salary and expense account. He comes back here, and for 5 years, the plantation's been being run by overseers. Jefferson says, oh, the ravages of overseers. And he has a larger extended family here, because he can almost never turn away a relative. But a bigger factor is, the minute he lands in Norfolk, incidentally to find out that in his absence at France, he's been appointed, or at least on the ship back, travel back, he's been appointed Secretary of State by President Washington. Slowly, that young idealistic Jefferson becomes, now the accommodating Jefferson, becomes the leader of a political party supported largely by holding on slavery. He's not talking about abolition to those people anymore. He's accommodating. He says on the one hand is justice, and on the other hand is preservation. And then the biggest factor, I think of all, some historians think similarly. Let's draw a big ass up here in the sky. We're going to put a couple of vertical lines down through it. It's the money. What did Eli Whitney invent? Okay, early 1790s. With the cotton gin, you take those seeds out of short staple cotton. You can grow short staple cotton now on marginal soil. Insatiable appetite for cotton over in Europe. And those cotton plantations just blossomed across the new Mississippi, Alabama, all the way across the South, even up into the Boot Hill of Missouri. But you got a problem. You got to solve a problem. You need workers in the field. As there was a saying in that day, for work, not fit for a white man. So you got to have workers in the field. But the transatlantic slave trade was ended in 1808. Sure, there's still pirate ships in effect running in slaves, but not enough. You need a lot of workers in the field to make your big fortune and have your big plantation. Come to Virginia. 4 out of every 10 enslaved people in America at that time are in Virginia. Virginia's a big state. It includes all of present-day West Virginia and more. So you come here. So to exemplify how valuable slaves become, they became the largest element of property value in southern plantations, southern owners. Here's an example. Jefferson died. 7 months after his death, the house was, well, actually a couple years after his death, the house was sold for, and the hill, for $7,500. A few years after that, then the value decreased. The house and hill fetched $2,500. The slaves sold up here on this lawn after Jefferson's death brought $30,000. So it's that big old ass in the sky with a vertical line straight. Now, how many years did Jefferson, did they say it took Jefferson to build the house? 40 years, right. If you were Jefferson, if I were Jefferson, we'd create an industrial street. You've got a lot of ironwork to be done, woodwork, a lot of goods to be, people to be taken care of. You've got to have the factories close to the house so you can save time, so you can be efficient. And if you want the workers to get up early in the morning, first crack of light, be at those factories, you're going to put their homes along there. There were about 20 buildings along there. 5 home sites, at least 5 cabins here where African-American families live, where black families lived along here, who worked primarily in the factories along here. Now, a year from now, you know, sorry if this disappoints you a little, but a year from now, the next stop we go to, there will actually be a reconstructed cabin, just the way it was 200 years ago. And a little bit farther down, a factory we visit, that will be reconstructed. In the present, we're going to have to sort of imagine it with our words and our imagination. We'll have to reconstruct more or less the words. We'll see foundations, but we won't see the structure. Now, slaves along here, living here, these 130, 135 people, these people who have not been born in Africa, who are as much as 4th generation Americans here, what were they after? What were they after in life? Well, they don't want Jefferson to fail, do they? If he fails, what's going to happen to him? I just said he sold 70 to pay interest on his debt. So some people are going to get sold. However, they're trying mostly, and we'll talk about it increasingly, not so much about Jefferson, but about them. We'll name them, talk about how they're creating meaning in their lives and how they're making out in this. If you really investigate it very thoroughly, and I know some of you teach you, some of you read an awful lot of history, if you dig very deeply into it, it was a pretty horrible system. Well, anything here or comments before we take off? Well, let's go down, and if you think about something on the pathway up to the next stop, let's just start off with that question or statement after I tell you, after I locate where we are. Okay? Yeah. Where are you traveling from?
Yeah.
Oh, what part? Oh, well, sometimes you just lose money there. Yeah. We have been running here this all summer. Okay. Yeah, this all summer it's been like this.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Kosciuszko left his fortune to Jefferson.
Yeah, right.
And to free his, for Jefferson to free his slave. How old was Jefferson at that time? And I gather he was in debt for
Jefferson was an old man. But you know, the money was pretty well tied up. There were other, in other words, it wasn't as free for Jefferson to use it as you think. There were other claimants to it. It was tied up in litigation. So it wasn't like the money was there, and he said, okay, I can now free this number of slaves because that's the money. The money was never in his country. That doesn't let Jefferson off the hook.
But was he eventually used?
Robert, no, it went to the family. It went back to the family. But that's a really key point. Let's talk about it. Yeah, come right on up, folks. Gather around. Yeah, come right a little bit closer, please. Who in the group speaks Polish? Anyone speak Polish? Pronounce the colonel's name again, because I always have Kosciuszko. Okay. One of our visitors mentioned that Kosciuszko, who was our chief of engineers on the American side of the Revolutionary War, a very important man to Jefferson, and Jefferson's friend too. Kosciuszko left a bunch of money, at least on paper, with the idea that Jefferson would free his slaves. It would help free the slaves. But to be honest with you, that money was never tangible. It was tied up in claimants. There were other people who had claim to it, and it was never like the money was laying there and Jefferson could say, oh, let's see, I can free 70 slaves with this. But not to let Jefferson off the hook. Whatever the excuses, if you wanted to free slaves, Robert Carter III, he's called Counselor Carter, freed 453 slaves just like that. Bang. Now, of course, it destroyed him politically. He was an anathema in the family, but he did it. And a neighbor of Jefferson, Edward Coles, came over here once, talked to Jefferson, and said, you know, boy, I sure admire you. And he was a relative. He said, Declaration of Independence, but you got to do something about slavery. And Jefferson said, you're right. Just as I wrote in the Notes of Virginia, it's an unremitting despotism, but the time is not yet right, and I'm an old man. It's up to you, you younger people. You'll work it out eventually. Edward Coles packs up the slaves there and said, you're going to go to freedom. Puts them on a boat to go down the Ohio River and said, I sure appreciate what you did for me all these years. You're all free, and you got 180 acres of land, I think it was, apiece. And that was his response to slavery. That cost him too. He eventually became governor of Illinois, but as governor of Illinois, he kept Illinois from reverting to a slave state, and it was really, really tough. But anyway, thanks for bringing that up. Yes, there were people who underwent the pain and disruption personally to them and did free slaves. Okay, well here we are. Let me tell you where we are, and I'm standing in the boundaries of an about 12 by 20 cabin site that we'll reconstruct. It will have a root cellar here on the floor. It'll have log walls, and then it'll have sideboarding. There'll be a sleeping loft up above, and there'll be a little, of course, a roof on the thing, and a kick-away wooden chimney. So if it gets on fire, you just kick it away, and the building doesn't burn down. We will have a poster up of the 8 people we think probably lived in here. We'll have one for little Billy, 3 years old, little Jimmy, 5 years old. Little Jimmy's job is to keep Billy from getting run over, because this was then a very busy thoroughfare. Mules and oxen and horses and carts and wagons and wheelbarrows, goods and materials flowing between the 3 units of Monticello: the house, the industrial street, and the cultivated lands and the pastures and the wood out here, and also the woodland up here and the mills along the river. So you could very easily lose a child. When we hope that the message board will say, do not look for the children 10 years of age and older. The young ladies are not here. They're working in the weaver's cottage down here. They're working all the daylight hours, 6 days a week. The young ladies, 10 years of age, go down there, childhood is over, and they will card and spin and weave material out of flax, hemp, cotton, wool, all the daylight hours. It'd be about 13 hours this time of year. Then at age 16, the decision is made about their future. For them, not by them. If they've been good workers, maybe that young lady might get a new spinning jenny, and that works tolerable. Not a good worker, send them to ground. Going to ground means you will go down in the fields and you will do the work of a man all your life. Jefferson's divided his farming land into 4 quarters. In the center of each of those is an overseer's house, white overseer with one exception one time, and there'll be a rim of cabins around that. The young lady that goes down there can have her hands on the plow and the hoe, except last 2 months of pregnancy, no heavy work, better food. Jefferson writes to Jack Epps, we have the letter, write it in a historical record. Remember, a woman that brings a child every 2 years is more profitable than the best man on the farm. Now, we'll put the young men to work. You don't see them here. We'll put them to work the next day. The husband, father, I use both terms for one individual. The wife, mother, not married in church. Pretty tight union. Oh, yes, they're holding together. And they're under travail. People tend to hold together. You know that from your own lifetime. Now, these people in there, they're not here in the daylight hours. There's a wash house, a smokehouse, a dairy. The woman's gone. The man's gone. There's mills here. There are factories here. He's gone. Here's who's here in the daylight hours. Grandpa and Grandma. I do tax assessor at property records for Jefferson for research for this group up here. And each year I'll see about 7 or 8 names along on Jefferson's tax payment record, and there'll be a notation not made by him, made by the tax assessor, and it'll be worth nothing. Here's an example. Doll. Each year I see her over several consecutive years. Age 58, doll, worth nothing. She very easily could have been the grandmother here. Who's washing the old clothes? Who's darning the old clothes? Who's cooking the evening meal? Whose shoulder do you cry on when you come in from a hard day? You gotta have grandma and grandma, or this group won't hold together. Were there hard days? Well, it all depended on, a lot of it on the overseers. Sometimes when Jefferson's gone, he will lease out part of the farm. He leased out Lego to a man named William Page. William Page turned out to be a whipper. Jefferson had a contract with him. He tried to pull the contract, it went into arbitration. William Page just kept doing what he was doing. So there were times whenever you needed a shoulder to cry on. Along here, the nail factory, the overseer for a number of years was Gabriel Lilly. He was a whipper. So you really need Grandpa and Grandma. Now, This family, these 8 people, they have a clothing allowance. They get a summertime suit of clothes once a year, get a wintertime suit of clothes once a year, per person of course, a blanket every 3 years. They are ration food. They're served as a food ration per person per week. That consists of a peck of cornmeal, a pound and a half of fatback pork, and a few salted fish. So those of you who are doing heavy labor or heavy exercise or have done it, you know you can't make it on that. And you don't have to. Because Mr. Jefferson, for his benefit and for the benefit of his family here, he will let you use the half-acre land down here. So you can grow in your spare time, like twilight and Sunday, and at night by a pine faggot that's lighted. You can grow potatoes, beets, cabbages, carrots, things that will store. And besides, on Sunday, like 200 years ago, right up there in the colonnade would have stood Anne, the eldest granddaughter of Jefferson. She had a notebook in this hand and a pencil in this hand, and she recorded purchases of excess food grown by slaves. Didn't pay them a lot, but paid them. She recorded, bought from John Hemmings 1 dozen and 8 chicken, bought from Betty Hemmings 2 dozen eggs, and bought from Squire Granger 10 eggs and a mess of salads and sprouts. She's got a bucket with cut pieces of Mexican silver in it. She pays them off. There are peddlers from Charlottesville, or if you're a trusted slave, you might get a pass to go down to Charlottesville. You can buy coffee and tea and sugar, and maybe mother in here would like finally to have some patterned material that you can create a dress that looks like something instead of those old rags that you can look at. If you go down below in our visitor center, go below the cafe to the Griffin Discovery Room. And so far, what I've described is just the washing and ironing of life, the dreary part of life. There's got to be more to it than that. Got to be more to it than that. Or there would have been, even as difficult as it was to get away, there would have been more than 10 runaways there. Well, how do we find out about it? 1, there's a way of physical evidence. 2, there's written evidence. Physical evidence we've discovered by digging up every cubic inch of diggable soil alone here. We find marbles or dominoes. We find, for the men, we find jaw harps, that little twangy thing you put in your mouth. We find the neck stiffles. We see that someone got a decent pair of shoes. It's a silver buckle. We see some broken chinaware. Somebody got a china dish. So we find those little things in it. We find once in a while a slate with scratch marks on it. A, B, C. Someone, the hard way, there were literate people here. They learned to read the hard way. So someone is working on their ABCs. Now, you don't have many written records, but you think about that for a second. Quakers and others, sometimes the Methodists, sometimes the Baptists, they're into pretty well for a number of years there. Not always, but for a number of years they're into abolition of slavery. So they sometimes would visit in Virginia, be near here. If you were enslaved here, a Quaker comes up to you, right? Are you going to really tell them what you think about slavery? Of course you aren't going to do it. That would be a pretty dumb thing to do that. After the Civil War, then we get written oral reports of what it was like. Then it's usually the ex-slave feels more free to do it. And we get stories that tell us about some of the meaning they created in their life. Here's an example. My favorite story about what it was like when they were really working on doing something other than labor in their lives. Man said, it's nighttime. We went to the mountain and we robbed the wild honey tree. And we brought back the honey, and we put it on hoe cakes that were in the fire. And they had a coffee pot. We drank coffee. We ate the cakes. And we played music and told stories into the night. Now here's all this noise down here. The family up there, or some members, wake up and they're puzzled. In some of the writings we get, why do slaves do that? They worked hard all day, and here in effect, they're partying down here. Slaves got it. They said, nighttime, that's slave time. Daytime, Jefferson time. But nighttime, slave time. we're going to go down and put the young men to work. But any comments and questions right here while we're standing here together?
What's the history behind the jumping of the broom?
I don't know a lot about that. I just know that it constantly jumping of the broom to symbolize marriage comes up over and over in the stories about slavery at that time. And then apparently it was taken very seriously. Here on this plantation, I know of no record where slaves were married in the church. One of the few advantages, and very few, for being a freed African American or free black in Virginia was that if you could find a minister that would do it, you could be married in the church. But jumping over the broomstick apparently was viewed as a solid a marriage contract by some societies as others. Slavery, there are books like Lacey Ford is a fantastic book by Dr. Lacey Ford about slavery. It's called Deliver Us from Evil. And he talks about the great differences in slavery. A lot better off to be in this position, maybe as a slave, maybe up in the Piedmont, Virginia. Heaven help you if you're in parts of South Carolina. And heaven or no one can help you if you're in the sugarcane fields of Louisiana. So it all depends. Sometimes, at least in the Piedmont, Virginia, jumping over the broomstick was a pretty solid contract. Great question. Well, let's go down and put the young men to work.
Oh, is this good?
And question, where the
Yes.
slaves buried? The
We're
one that died.
going to bring that right up.
Oh, okay.
That's underlined.
Okay.
That's a biggie. And we won't let that one go. I think that is symbolic. It's very important. Good. Thank you. Oh, yeah. You're increasing. I get people who don't want to hear this.
No, I think it's
They're
great.
invariably white and often from the deep south.
Yeah. You see, my wife, she's from Romania. I'm from Trinidad.
Oh,
So
good for you. And how do I pronounce Tucson? The great king of Santo Domingo, they sold to Tucson. How do you say that name? Tucson. La Obica, his name.
Yeah, that's good.
Boy, he was a soldier. God, he scared the hell out of these people. Yeah, come right on up, folks. Where we locate ourselves first before we start talking. So we have left view of the thoroughbred stable. We walk by the weaver's cottage, walk by the graveyard of the mother of Commodore Levy, who did such a great job saving the house. Walk by the nail making factory. No, we haven't walked there yet. We walk up to the nail making factory. Here we are. Before we talk about the young men in here, anything pressing on your mind about what we said, or something to clarify, anything before I tell you about the yo?
Do you use produce from the garden for anything right now?
Yes, we do. Produce from the garden, one, let it go to seed, and you can take out a loan and you can buy some seed down in the Vista Center. And then if you have a salad down in the little cafe down there, you will be eating, if there's greenery in it, it came out of here. And thirdly, we give it to charity. Sometimes there's an awful lot of squash, a lot of beans and things, and that goes downtown to the food bank. Yep. That's what it's done. Well, here's what would happen. When we rebuild this, there'll be a roof, there'll be a wall, and there'll be doors. We deliberately will start a big charcoal fires in here so you get the feeling of just how hot it was. Because in Jefferson's day, the blacksmith would come in about 2:33 in the morning and light a big fire so you get very mature charcoal in here, white hot. Young man comes in, first crack of light, walks up to his workstation, walks up. On one side is a bundle of nail rod like this. On the other side is an anvil and a hammer, key tool. That hammer will have to rise and fall several thousand times during those daylight hours for him to make his quota of 500 to 800 nails. Little nails, big nails, about 500 nails a day. Little nails, maybe 10 penny, 8 penny, 800. He better make it or come close, or he'll lose his job. If you lose your job, you lose a quart of molasses a week, all the lean pork you can eat, salted fish, definitely better food. Also, to take away your red suit or blue suit that was making mother so proud back here, who would say, my son is learning a trade. He is not behind the plow. So there were reasons to stay in here, even though it was mindless, it was hot, it was noisy. Can you imagine 10 hammers going, and heaven knows how hot it was in here. Well, how did the young men stay sane? Well, they played pranks on each other. And the young men do that sort of thing. The chief prankster was a young man named Brown. He tended to shy away from Terry, one of the older young boys, because Terry was so sober about everything. But one day, he hid all of Terry's nail rods, so Terry walks in. He has nothing to produce. The overseer of the nail-making factory is Gabriel Lilly, and Lilly is a whipper. So Terry is frantic. He grabs a hammer, and maybe he didn't even think about it. Cracks Brown's skull. Whoop! Up from Charlottesville comes the doctor and bores into the skull, and Barry saves Brown's life. The report goes up to Washington, and he sends down the order, I want Terry sold. I want him sold so as if to others he had never lived. I want him sold south. And sure enough, he was sold to slave traders. Around plantations throughout this north here, and incidentally, a lot of people up in New York and New Jersey owned slaves too, and they were selling them south. They were selling them south. The slave traders would go by a plantation and see if there was some troublemaker. There's somebody you want to get rid of? Okay, we'll take him south. So they took Terry out of here, and he's gone. Now, one young man, Joe Fawcett, didn't get into trouble like that. He's a good nail maker. He finally made his quota, and the head of the blacksmith shop is a white man called William Stewart, who drinks an awful lot. And Jefferson got sick of what he called the idle thought. Fires him, and Joe Fawcett gets blacksmith shop. Well, Joe Fawcett's life's going pretty well. He reaches his maturity, the age of 21, and he marries the head cook up here. Her name is Edith Fawcett, trained by a great French chef in the White House. So there's Joe and Edith married in this, and their life comparatively is better than other slaves here. And they have several children. They have 6 children. Then some clouds begin to appear on the horizon because Joe Fawcett, who's trusted to travel, isn't the only one trusted to travel a little bit. The butler is also allowed to go to Richmond and buy some goods or something. And also the gardener here traveled, and they began to compare notes. And they said, have you noticed we are no longer buying the quality and quantity of goods we used to buy? And have you noticed we are never given enough money to pay the goods, only enough money to extend the line of credit. They put it together. He's going broke. He's an old man, he's near death, he's going broke, so what's going to happen to them? Their property, what's going to be sold? So John Hemmings and Burl Colbert and Joe Fawcett, our primary substitute, went to Jefferson and pleaded that on the basis of merit, didn't they deserve to be freed in his will? Jefferson agreed. So he said, okay, but I'll have to get a special okay from the legislature to enable you to remain in Virginia after you're freed. Because the 1806 law of Virginia says, if a slave is freed, that slave has 1 year to get out of Virginia or be re-enslaved. But he said, I'll do it. And the old man did. Jefferson did. 7 months after Jefferson's death, there's a slave auction up here on this lawn, and Joe Fawcett is not sold. Who sold? His wife Edith. 6 kids, one by one. Joe Fawcett, they had no right, they weren't free. But Joe Fawcett is frantic, but he's also resourceful. Here was his pitch. He'd go up to someone, the person who bought Edith, his wife, and said, you know my work, I'm going to have a blacksmith shop in Charlottesville. When I have the money, can I buy my wife back from you? And they shook hands with him. Believe it or not, that was honored a few years later. And Joe worked and pleaded with each of the buyers. There were different buyers. One person did buy 2, one single person, 2 of the children. An agreement, a parole agreement was struck, a gentleman's agreement, and it worked, except for the last one. Joe's favorite son was Peter Fawcett. Peter Fawcett, remembering that time, said, I had a red hat, red shoes, and I wore a blue suit. And I was a messenger boy in the house. And I had been taught how to read by the grandson. And he said, I hardly knew how to play. Well, he was bought by Colonel Jones, and Colonel Jones was an evil man. Colonel Jones looked Joe Fawcett in the face. Joe didn't know it. He looked Joe Fawcett in the face and said, yes, I will sell your son back to you when you have the money. And Joe thought, this is all right, because I'm going to have a blacksmith shop 2 blocks down the street from Colonel Jones's place. I can watch my son grow up until I buy him and free him and take him out of here. Well, that's not going to happen that easy. But I'll tell you what, we're going to save Peter Fawcett from slavery at the next stop. Okay, you guys are going to be all right if it gets lightning and thunder. I'll run off up on the field and hold this up. Just to protect you. I would do it.
Much appreciated.
I would do it. You know, we are going to get something, but I don't know how soon.
Yeah, we were watching the local channel this morning, and they said after 4 o'clock, expect thunderstorm.
Okay, I think that's true.
Yes.
I say after, at least after, maybe after 3. We are at woodworking, and there's a progression of increasing refining in the wood as we go in this direction. We start off over here with logs coming down from the mountain. Then there's a saw pit where a man on either end of the log are creating big beams out of the log. In here, there was a plank floor, and there was sort of a planing machine in here, and they would create planks out of the beam. Finally, with the introduction of some mahogany over here and smaller pieces of wood, John Hemmings is over here making beautiful furniture. Do you remember the chairs at the chess set in the parlor? Yeah. That's typical of John Hemmings' work. Masterful. John Hemmings freed in Jefferson, only 5 people freed in Jefferson's will. John Hemmings is one of those individuals. But he's an old man. He's nearly blind. The last thing he ever built was a chestnut coffin Jefferson lies buried in 100 yards down this hillside over here. So it's not a very big deal to bury a man here. There's a few years left to spend on life. That's not the situation with the children of John Hemmings' sister. John Hemmings' sister is Sally Hemmings. She has 4 children, and say Monticello, the historian, those are also the children of Jefferson, his shadow family. The names are Beverly, man's name, sister Harriet, and then 2 younger ones, Madison and Esther. Beverly and Harriet are freed 4 years before Jefferson died, at about age 21. Beverly leaves with $600 in his pocket. That's an enormous amount of money. With skills, He's put on the stage in broad daylight with no publicity, and he's sent to Maryland, and he's gone. And he goes off our record, off our radar, off history's radar. Shortly thereafter, Harriet is also leaves with money, is put on the stage in broad daylight, and goes out of here. The White family record up here says they ran away. Sure, I believe it. 4 years later, after Jefferson's death, 5 people freed in Jefferson's will. The other remaining 2 children of Sally, Madison and Eston, are freed and also have the right to remain in Virginia, which is a good thing because Sally is not freed. Sally is given, she's not mentioned in the will. She is by the family, by Martha, the mistress of the household. She is given her time, which was an unofficial way of taking the fetters of slavery off of you. And you just sort of, in effect, they said, just go down and live with your sons in Charlottesville. Forget about all this, or we don't want to talk about it. You're down there. You don't have any papers, so you better only stay in county. You don't want to go outside of the county, or you might be re-enslaved. But you're out of here. You're unofficially free. She goes down in Charlottesville and lives with Madison and Eston, who have good jobs. They, valiant people, loyal. They stay for 8 years, and then Sally dies. She's buried somewhere. No one knows where she's buried. We think she lies under Charlottesville somewhere, but we will never know that. So, little Peter Fawcett, he's got he wants to spend his life for something good and worthwhile. But what's going to happen to him? Well, it didn't start off very well. Little Peter Fawcett was given a going-away present by the family up here because they esteemed him so highly. But that's kind of an odd gift to give someone who's going to work from a hard man, a hard master. They gave him a spelling book. He goes down, he's standing by the fireside reading the spelling book, and Jones walks in and he's livid. He grabs the book, hurls it in the fire, and said, "I ever catch you reading again, you get the biblical 39 license." Then Jones also threatens his own son. So little Peter Fawcett becomes 12, and as he moves into his teenage years, though, he develops a couple of buddies, the sons of Colonel Jones, who hate the old man. Peter Fawcett becomes a teacher of reading, the nighttime teacher of reading out in the woods, here and there in little places where slaves on some of these plantations will learn how to read. That's Peter Fawcett. And then he starts doing, as he becomes his mature years, moves into his manhood, he starts doing more than that. He's taught how to write, and he writes very well. He's writing papers of passage. Now, a paper of passage, here's what that was. Some of you know that. As slaves become more valuable, and as there are insurrections like Nat Turner, and as there was all that successful rebellion in San Domingo, now called Haiti, by that brilliant general and leader Toussaint, there's fear of slaves, and yet you want to possess this property. So increasingly, the laws of Virginia and other southern states really tighten up. The laws tighten for movement and for assembly. So if you're going to write a paper passage, it better be really written well, or somebody's going to get in trouble, maybe even get hung. He becomes a master of the little paper passage. He writes one for Isabel. She gets out of here. She goes all the way to Boston. She's not coming back. So, in short, he becomes a threat. Back in Cincinnati, Joe Fawcett's been slowly reassembling his family one by one, trip to Virginia. The last trip he ever took was to buy Peter Fawcett, free him down here in the county record. I've seen the record. Take him to Ohio, and then Peter Fawcett has a long life to spend on Peter. Spends it very well. Very successful in the catering business, the fastest growing city in America, Cincinnati. He becomes an ordained Baptist minister and is known as the father of the Black Baptist churches of Ohio. During the Civil War, he becomes a captain in the Cincinnati Black Brigade. Look it up. First all African-American unit on the northern side in the war. And a lot of honors come his way. He's important in the Underground Railway. His life goes along, gets to be an old man. He's 85 years of age, and he's back here visiting in the year 1900. And his host is Jefferson Monroe Levy, the nephew of Commodore that day is doing a good job maintaining the house, and he receives him graciously. My thinking was, are you out of your mind? Why on earth would you come back here? Your brother and sister sold up there on our lawn. You know, why on earth would you come back to the scene of the crime? Well, there's two reasons for the deal. One is nostalgia. His roots were here. He was born here. Any of us where we were born and where we first, you might say, knew presence, where we first knew presence, that's a very important place to be. He's back here for nostalgia. He said he walks up toward the parlor and he hears the laughter of women and the sound of the harpsichord. That's of the old days. There's no one in the parlor. But then he starts wandering around the property at free will. Mr. Levy with him sometimes. They go down to the graveyard here, for example. Then you realize what he's after. He's declaring it's a symbolic journey. It declares a moral ownership, an ethical ownership in it, as if to say, I am Peter Fawcett, the Reverend Peter Fawcett, and I own a bit of Monticello too, and we own Monticello too. It's not just the Jeffersons and the Epps and the Randolphs. It is our Monticello. We leveled the hilltop. We hauled in the thousands of tons of dirt. We dug the foundations in some of the hardest and heaviest rock on earth. We did the beautiful finished work here. And always is our labor, our giving of our years of life that made you famous for your hospitality, and also created the leisure time for your great thoughts and for the wonderful things you did for the country. It's our Monticello. He goes down to the graveyard here, and there was an iron fence around it then, and you know that Peter Fawcett noted that when you look at those tombstones as opposed to an African graveyard, African-American graveyard, you go down here where white people are buried and will always be buried, according to the association. Everyone that's buried down there is white. You see the pedigree of the family, you see when they're born, you see when they died. There's something important about it. They were delegate, colonel, the wife of Captain so-and-so. You know, something really important about them. African Americans, Peter Fawcett goes down there, the graveyard has a split rail fence around it. You can visit it too. Just go out from the courtyard down there and you'll go to a split rail fence around an area where once in a while there's a gravestone about that big marking, we think, a grave site there. Nothing engraved on it. And when the light is right, late in the evening sometimes, you'll see a faint depression and someone's buried there. And we have a message board with 40 names on it. Where's Davy Hearn? Really buried? Somewhere there. Where's the matriarch of the family buried? Elizabeth Henry? Somewhere there. We don't know. But what a difference. Peter Fawcett writes about that. He goes back to Ohio in the year 1901. Dies at the age of 86. The great Peter Fawcett, who rose as high, considering how far he had to climb up in his own way as Jefferson did from where he climbed to the great height we honor on Mount Rushmore. Now, I'm going to tell you a going-away story and leave a question with you. Jamie Hubbard, Phil Hubbard, brother. Jamie makes charcoal. Very important. Charcoal is how you have controlled heat in stew stoves. Without charcoal, you couldn't produce the kind of meals that Jefferson demanded. Charcoal also is what you put in those Rittenhouse stoves on the second floor and heats the second floor. You can't have wood up there in those, you'll smoke everybody out. Jamie is really important. His brother Phil is a social carpenter and he makes shoes too. They don't react to slavery the same way. Jamie can't stand it. He runs away. Brought back. Jefferson does not punish him. Too valuable. Runs away again. Now it costs Jefferson a lot of frustration, money to get him back. Jefferson, he writes, to make an example out of him, he has him whipped severely in front of other workers. And Jefferson sells it to a Mr. Perry in Richmond. A few months later, this ad appears in Richmond paper. Runaway, Jamie Hubbard, charcoal maker, 6 feet tall, stout of limbs, a man, bold features, a man of daring demeanor. That's what it says, a man of daring demeanor. Well, did he get away? And that's the question, but that's not the key question. You gotta eat, you gotta sleep, you got no map, you have no compass, 300 miles to Ohio, a lot of people willing to turn you in. Did he get away? We don't know that. Here's the question. You and I, or me, and here I am, Why wasn't I an enslaved person here 200 years ago? Could have been. Fate would do it. I could have been. Why should I not be? Why should I be a white person this time? I could have been here. Let's say that I was here, or you were here. Would you have been a Jamie? Would you have been a Phil? Would you have been a Jamie saying, this is evil and I'm not going to stand it. I'm going to take the risk. Or would you have been a Phil? And that's a tough one to answer. Listen, folks, 100 yards down here is the graveyard. Don't forget the African American graveyard down below. And I'm going to walk back this way. And do think about maybe getting on the cover because I think in about 30 minutes you're going to have it. Thanks for
Just like the graveyard, yeah.
just position yourself open head straight out.
Can you explain where's the slave or a graveyard?
Right way to the shuttle, please.